Number 1. The Storm. This is more of a story about how I developed a fear that I now find quite paralyzing. I grew up in a fishing family, and so at the time, going out in the ocean in my dad's boat was nothing unusual for me. It was a nice-sized boat, and he generally had a crew of a few steady guys, but would also occasionally have to hire some workers who would only be working on one trip. There was no shortage of these guys who would hang out at the docks, hoping that a boat would hire them for a day's work. When I got old enough, I began somewhat working on the boat too. My family didn't force me to do it though. I had older brothers who had absolutely zero interest in going out on the boat. But for me, it was always very interesting, and I couldn't wait until I was old enough to start helping out. When I was 13, I was allowed to start coming along. However, I really didn't get any real work to do. Mostly it was just cleaning work, but that really didn't bother me because I enjoyed just being out on the ocean. I had no doubt at the time in my life that I absolutely intended to follow in my father's footsteps and inherit the family business at some point. When I was 15 years old, after 2 years of helping out on the boat, something happened that made it impossible for me to follow in my father's footsteps. My dad picked up a couple of guys off the docks to help out. They weren't anyone that I had ever seen before, but I didn't give it much thought at the time because this was something that happened all the time. One of the guys, though, I just got a really off feeling about. But that was something for my dad to worry about, since I had never really did work with those guys. One of the things that you have to pay attention to more than anything else when you're in this industry is the weather. It affects just about every aspect of a fishing trip, so you have to constantly be monitoring it. And that was one of the things that I had begun helping out with as I got older. That being said, the weather is still not 100% predictable, and sometimes it can really surprise you. On this day, it did just that. We were pretty far out on the ocean when what had seemed like a beautiful day began to take a turn for the worse. The barometric pressure began falling really fast, and we all saw the clouds begin moving in. We hadn't seen any reason to believe there was a storm coming before that, but that sort of thing happens sometimes, and one was definitely coming at this time. This was only cause for minor concern though. In fact, we were more concerned about the fishing being affected by the storm than anything bad happening to us. We all had been on the ocean during storms before, and we knew how to handle it. Although normally my dad's way of having me handle it was to stay below deck. Storms can have a positive effect on fishing, actually. The drop in pressure makes fish feed more aggressively, and that's a good thing. But it also can make the process of catching them a bit difficult with the waves and the wind. Lots of things could go wrong. But to get on with it, the storm took us by surprise and moved in really quickly. The wind and the waves picked up considerably, and although it was daytime, it got very dark outside. But none of this stopped the fishing from taking place. Like I said, the crew knew what they were doing. I can't really explain what they did though, as it wasn't something I was allowed to do yet, and haven't done since. Normally, I would have been told to get under deck as soon as possible when the storm came in, but it was so sudden, and I had to gather some things on the deck to get them inside as well. I wasn't able to finish this quickly, and that's when the guy that I had mentioned, the guy we hired for the day who gave me a bad feeling, offered to help me out. I was appreciative of the help, and it seemed to be going fine at first. However, at one point, while gathering some things up, I was right next to the railing. I suddenly felt something pin me up against it. I was facing the railing when it happened, so it came up from behind me and hit me so suddenly that I came off of my feet. I felt like I was going to fall over and into the ocean. It took me a minute to realize that someone was holding me up against the railing. I couldn't turn around and see who it was, but I knew it was the guy who had been offering to help me. All I could do is looked down at the huge waves and the dark, deep water while feeling like I was going to be chucked over the side into it. The guy said something to me, but it was difficult to really make out most of it. All I really caught was something about how if I fell into the wild ocean, nobody would probably ever be able to find me. I don't know how long he held me against that railing, but it was the most terrifying experience of my entire life. I kept expecting him to throw me over, and all I could do was keep looking at the water. Eventually, he let go of me, though. One of the other crew had come over to check on me, but I think the guy released me before the other crew member could see what was happening. I slipped and fell on the deck, but then quickly got up and ran inside the boat. I locked myself in a room below deck and stayed there until my dad came to check on me much later. I didn't tell my dad what happened right away. Honestly, it was kind of humiliating, and I thought he wouldn't bring me back out if he knew about it. However, when we got back to the docks, I let him know, so he wouldn't tire that guy ever again. Knowing my dad, he probably took his crew and beat the crap out of the guy too. I know that I never saw him hanging around the docks looking for a job ever again. Unfortunately, however, I got really and truly terrified of boats, ships, and the ocean after the experience. It became nearly impossible for me to get on a boat. I went out with my dad a few more times before stopping completely. I never told him why, though, just that I had to spend more time concentrating on my schoolwork. I think if he knew that I had developed this fear, he would have forced me to try and conquer it. I just didn't want to do that at all. But to this day, I won't go out on the water. My family has been wanting to go on cruises with the whole family, but I can't even go on them. Seeing those big ships almost always makes me feel faint, as I remember how close I was to going into that deep, dark ocean. Number 2. Texting. This happened when I was in high school. My boyfriend and I would often send texts to each other at night when we were supposed to be asleep. It was mostly harmless, and teenagers often like to stay up later than they are supposed to. I mean, technically, neither of us had a bedtime. We were 17 years old at the time, but on school nights, we were still expected to try and get some reasonable amount of sleep each night. So this happened after 1 a.m. The two of us hadn't been talking that night, as I had a lot of homework to get done, and that wouldn't happen if we had been talking. But I got a text message from him telling me that his parents weren't home. He asked if I could sneak out of the house and come over to his place. I was half asleep at the time. I told him it sounded like fun, but I was just way too tired. I would just have to wait and see him at school the following day. At first, he just kept trying to change my mind. He told me we could have something to drink because the liquor cabinet wasn't locked. We could have the run of the entire house if I came over. And I kept turning him down because I really was exhausted, and the only thing I wanted to do was go to sleep. So then he started begging. I just figured he must have been really horny or something, and that was the reason he was persisting. But normally he knew that when I said no, I could sometimes have my mind change. So I didn't blame him for continuing to try. However, I told him that I couldn't, and that was that. I would see him the next day. I turned over then, and very quickly fell asleep. A loud smashing noise woke me up out of my dreams. It took me a while to clear my head and figure out what happened, but something had broken my bedroom window. My bed was right next to this window, and it was now covered in shattered glass. I looked out the window and I saw someone standing outside in the yard. However, they were wearing dark clothing, and I couldn't make out who it was, but they didn't look familiar in any way. I only saw the figure for a brief moment, and then he took off running down the street. The next thing I heard was my parents knocking on the door. I told them to come in and they turned on the lights. My dad helped me get out of the bed, without getting myself all cut up by the glass that was now all over the place. While my mom called the police, my dad found a huge rock laying among all the glass. When the police came over, after looking around a bit, they found a phone laying in the yard. I recognized the case right away. It was my boyfriend's phone, and it was the one that he had to have been texting me on earlier in the night. I told them about the text earlier, and they immediately assumed my boyfriend got mad at me and he broke the window. However, I was sure that the guy I had seen in the yard and running away was not my boyfriend. Their body shape and size were nothing alike. Still, the police had to go over to the house. Surprisingly, no one was home at all. They did, however, find signs of a break-in at the house. When contact was made with my boyfriend's parents, we found out that his grandma had suffered a stroke that night, and the family had left to go to the hospital. My boyfriend went with them, but he was in such a hurry that he hadn't brought his phone with him. They were all just worried about getting to see his grandma. Whoever was texting me, later confirmed, was not my boyfriend. It was someone who had broken into his house and used his phone to try and lure me over to the house. But there were also things stolen from the house too, which was probably the original reason for the break-in. So this is where the whole story gets even creepier. Someone had to know several things in order to do this. They had to know the house was empty, meaning they would have likely had to see the whole family leave. That means it had to be someone who lived in the immediate area close to them. At first I thought it had to be someone who knew me and knew I was his girlfriend, but that could have probably been figured out by looking through our text messages. My boyfriend grew up in that house all of his life, and he knew all of his neighbors. Several of them were schoolmates, but there were also a couple houses occupied by older people, so any of them could have been awake and seen the family leave. A lot of people were questioned by the police, but no one was ever arrested for that break-in. Number 3. Bitch. When my parents got divorced, we ended up living with my dad, because my mom didn't have a place to live or a job history of any kind. My dad had a better lawyer and got custody of us. I don't know how much he really wanted custody of us. I think he just didn't want our mom to have it. One of the reasons why I think this is because he would always hire live-in babysitters for us. I can remember going through about 6 of them once in a year. I would find out much later that he would try to hire attractive ones, and he would make sexual advances toward them. That was why so many of them quit. However, it is also the way that we met the woman who would later become our stepmom for a while. At first we kind of liked her. She was much closer to our ages than she was to our dad. We actually wondered why she would have anything to do with him. But the relationship seemed to work, and eventually they got married. Unfortunately, life got really bad after the marriage, when my dad decided to quit working and moved all of us out to the country. He was still getting a little bit of money each month, but it was hardly enough for a family to live on. So we were constantly living in poverty. There were months where we wouldn't have any food for days, as we waited for his monthly paycheck to come in. My stepmother proved to be a much different person than she had seemed at first. In short, she ended up being a lazy bitch. Basically, us 3 kids were supposed to do all the housework, while she sat on her ass and watched TV all day. And she would routinely threaten us with violence whenever we resisted this in any way. It wasn't long before she got pregnant, and she eventually gave birth to my younger brother. And her and my father's laziness only got worse after that. They had the child, but they barely did anything to take care of him. We were expected to do it. In fact, I remember once when I had the flu, they only allowed me to remain home from school if I spent the day taking care of the baby, so they could be lazy all day. Eventually, my older brother left and went to live with my mom, who had gotten a job and remarried and gotten an apartment, My younger sister and I wanted to go and live with her too, but every time we brought it up, our dad would threaten us with violence until we changed our minds. My dad did eventually get a job driving a truck, and would sometimes be gone for several nights. Getting left alone with that woman who also would cheat on him all the time was a nightmare. They put my brother's crib in my room, and I was expected to take care of him all of the time, including changing him and feeding him in the middle of the night. I was 13 years old at the time. Well, one night while I was sleeping, I was woken up by my door being thrown open. The hallway light was on, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the doorway. When I cleared my head, I could see it was my stepmother. She came into the room and started yelling and screaming things at me like a lunatic. I was about to get up and defend myself until I noticed that she had a chef's knife in her hand. She threatened me with the knife, holding it up to my neck and telling me that if I ever tried to hurt her baby, she would slit my throat, and she wouldn't care if she went to jail for it. She pressed the knife up against my neck, and for a while, I thought the crazy bitch was gonna do it. However, after ranting and raving for a while, she finally backed off. She was still yelling and screaming though, and she left the room and slammed my bedroom door. I had no idea what had just happened, but I couldn't even call the police right away because we didn't have a phone at the time. I did, however, leave the house and walked over to the neighbor's house and told them what happened. They called the police, but since we lived a little bit out in the country, it took a while for them to get there. My stepmom didn't deny anything, but she told the police a bold-faced lie. She told them she heard me abusing the baby on the baby monitor. She told them she had to go and get the knife in order to protect her baby from me. Fortunately, the police saw right through her story. The baby had no injuries on him at all, and when the police arrived, he was still in the crib in my bedroom. They asked her if I was abusing the baby. Why had she left him in my bedroom after the incident that she admitted to? They arrested her for assault. That's when I found out that assault isn't the act of actually hurting someone. It's the act of making them reasonably fear harm. My dad came back the following day. My sister, brother, and I were at my aunt's house, where we were dropped off the night before. My dad took the baby and left, while completely believing and supporting his wife in the incident. My sister and I shortly after went to live with our mom. Within the next year, our stepmother left my dad with the baby. He had permanently destroyed any relationship I'd ever had with him for his actions. For a long time after, I would have nightmares about that woman coming in and threatening to kill me with that knife. It was the scariest thing to ever happen to me.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.